Hello friends and welcome back to the Hall of Craft. Today I'm coming back to you guys with another meaty build. This time, Quarantine Edition, which means the beard's out in full force. I got the curly red beard and the name Alistair. I've never felt so in touch with my Scottish heritage. And today I'm going to be making a bridge, but not just any old one-use set piece bridge. No, because if you know anything about me, you know that I live in a small apartment with little to no storage space. So every piece of crafting and terrain that I make, I need to be 100% sure that I'm going to get multiple uses out of it, or else it just doesn't feel like it's earned space on my shelf. So this is going to be a modular bridge that comes in segments that you can arrange however you please, and one of the segments will have a detachable multi-story guard tower. I was really inspired by images like this one of classic medieval bridges with the archways on the bottom and the guard towers incorporated into them. So that's what I'm going to be trying to replicate today. So anyway, let's just jump into this build and I'll show you how I put the whole thing together. I'm going to start by quickly sketching out the profile of my bridge and roughly guessing at what the dimensions should be. This ended up being a bit of a process because I have this internal battle every time I start a craft where I want to make it way bigger than it needs to be, but I have to rein myself back in to make it a more reasonable size. The plan here is to build a frame for my segments out of medium weight chipboard and then layer foam core details on top of that. This will give me a bit more weight and strength than just a hollow frame of foam core. And it's also going to mean I'm not chopping up giant chunks of polystyrene, which I'm running a little low on due to the lockdown. For the sizing, I settled on something like 3.5 by 4 inches length and width, and then 2.5 inches high. And the tower segments will be 3 inches in diameter and 3 inches in height. Keeping in mind that I'll be starting this build with medium weight chipboard as kind of a skeleton, and then I'll be layering it out with foam core that's going to add about a ½ inch of thickness on all those dimensions because of the foam core addition. So one of the major materials I'll be using in this build is these veggie chip canisters. Me and my partner have been going to town on these things, and they're pretty much the exact same dimensions as a Pringles can, and I've saved about 9 of them. So I figured I would try to do something and kind of, reuse this material and see what I could get out of them. These canisters are about the same thickness as the chipboard, so that works out pretty well. When cutting chipboard, for elaborate cuts, you really want to take your time with a sharp knife, doing multiple passes to get a clean cut. But for simpler, chunkier bits, you can save a ton of time by using kitchen scissors. So I'm going to use that technique to cut out all of my archways. And then, to try and get them as smooth and uniform as possible, I'll clamp them together in my man hands and sand them down with a sanding block. I will repeat those steps and techniques when cutting out the rest of my pieces for the frames. These are all rectangles of various sizes to make the tops, sides, and bottom of the bridge. The only tricky pieces now are the archway pieces at the edge of the bridge. There is no magic formula used here. I just traced out the height and then the curve of the archway, and I knew that I wanted it to be about 4 inches long, so I made the slope as gradual as I could within those dimensions so to make it not too steep for a mini. And then I cut that out 4 times. So now that I have most of my pieces cut out and shaped to be relatively uniform, it's time to start gluing them together. For this, I'm just using my hot glue gun on low temp, and I'm gluing them edge to edge. This can be a little tricky, but with a little practice, you can get a clean connection. I'm also making sure to wipe away any glue that shoots out on the outside when you press the 2 pieces together. After these connections are dry, you can always go back and reinforce the inside with more hot glue. Okay, so once all your pieces are glued together, you should have a little archway that looks like this. Now I'll just repeat that 2 more times to finish all my segments. You could make more or less of these if you want a longer or shorter bridge. Now to glue together the ramp pieces. After those are together, we need to cut out some more cardboard to be on the top of the ramps. For this, I'm going to use a cracker box because it's thinner than the chipboard and it'll be able to bend to the shape of the ramp more easily. It's a little funky due to the curve, but I'm just going to trace out the width that I need and roughly mark it out, and then cut out the strip to be longer than I think it will need to be, and then glue it on to the ramp and cut off the excess. Make sure to glue the printed side of the packaging down, because the unprinted side takes paint and glue way better. Okay, so now that we have our basic skeleton segments just about complete, I just need to add the curved parts to the bottoms. For this, you could use the packaging like the cracker boxes if you don't have any Pringles cans, but I want to make use of these cans. So I'm going to measure out how big they need to be to fit my segments, and then cut them to size and glue them in place with more hot glue. Make sure to remove the metallic lining on the inside of the cans. Once they're attached, I'm going to trim any overlap with a sharp knife or scissors. Both will work well here, but I found a cleaner result was achieved when I used the scissors. So now I'm going to move on to the tower. I'll take a new canister and measure out 2 segments for my tower, and then cut them out. Then I'll sand them to be flat and remove any imperfections from my cuts. While I'm doing this, I'm also going to sand the exterior that is printed on the cans. This will rough it up and help glue and paint stick better to the outside. I'm going to take some of my last XPS foam and make some 1-inch pillars to bracket the sides of my bridge and tower. This is going to be a very similar technique to what I had done in my modular tower video, link in the top right if you missed that. So I'll just mark out the pillars and cut them with my utility knife. One mistake I made here was that I didn't factor in the height that would be added to the bridge later on when I add the foam core. So my pillars ended up being slightly too short and I had to bulk them out later. So if you're following along, keep that in mind. So I'm going to glue 2 of the pillar segments to the middle of one of my bridge segments, and then place the first tower segment and line them up with the sides of that and glue them in place. And then I'll do the same thing with the second tower segment. Up until now, I had my tower segments at 4 inches due to my inability to scale things down. But here, I actually conquer my demons and decide to shave them down to a much more reasonable 3 inches. Okay, so that's our basic bridge skeleton complete, and now it's time to start bringing this thing to life with some details. I'm gonna bust out the foam core and start measuring out all of my panels to cover up my frames. I have already peeled all of the paper off of these pieces of foam core because I know I'm going to be drawing on details into the foam later on. Make sure to factor in the width of the foam core here and where it overlaps with itself on your framework. The foam core has the potential to add up to a ½ inch in length if it overlaps on both sides. It is always easier to trim away extra foam core than it is to add more on. For all my side pieces, I want the foam core to extend up higher than the bridge. This is going to add a railing onto the edges. So I made the railing extend about 3/4 of an inch past the baseline of the bridge. Because I'm adding foam core on top, that'll work out to be about a ½ inch railing at the end of the day. Once everything has been traced out, you just need to have yourself a good old-fashioned cutting montage, and then you can move on to the next step. Solid. Now you have all your cutout pieces, it's time to draw on your bricks. For this, I'm going to use a ½ inch by 1 inch pattern. This will speed things up a bit because your bricks are slightly bigger than you would normally do, and I think that's okay for a large bridge. They wouldn't have made this thing with a bunch of tiny bricks, they're using like big stone slabs. Make sure for the side pieces to extend your brick pattern onto the sides and to the back, because those parts will be visible on the railings. This part is a bit tedious, but it really makes a big difference. Just power through all those bricks on your segments, and then you'll wind up here. Off camera, I drew a more cobblestone pattern on all of my pieces that will be the floor pieces of my bridge. This has a really cool look to it, and I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. If you have a texture roller, this would really speed up that process, but just make sure that you're not pressing so hard as that it warps or bends the foam, because your railing will have like no structural integrity left if you kind of beat the crap out of it. So now after my brick patterns are done, I'm just going to use the tinfoil ball technique to give all my foam core pieces stone texture. Once that's finished, you're ready to start assembly. This part is super simple. You just hot glue all of your foam segments onto the frames of your bridge pieces. However, one key mistake I made here, which I have to correct for later, is that I didn't factor in how much the foam core would make my segments longer on both sides. and I didn't make my side pieces long enough to overlap. So, once it's all assembled, there's going to be some awkward gaps in my railing. But that is okay, I can fix it later, but for now I'm just going to finish gluing all my pieces onto my frames. For the middle piece with the XPS pillars, I just cut around them and glue my side pieces on anyway. So here's what I'm working with after all my foam core pieces are glued in place. Now I have a bit of a height gap on my pillars like I said before, so I just cut some foam core squares and glue them into place. One key thing that I did for all the archways on the underside of my bridge segments is that I didn't cut them to shape before gluing my foam core onto my frame. This is so that I can cut away the excess perfectly to shape while they're still in place, rather than trying to guess as to what it's going to be and hoping it lines up. This way I can be certain that I know it's going to line up. Just make sure to use a sharp knife when you do this step. So now to cover up the exposed undersides of my archway on the bridge, as well as the tower itself, I'm going to be cutting a bunch of 1 inch by 1/2 inch bricks and then gluing them into place. Cut out more than you think you're going to need here. This pile I have is not enough. I actually have to probably make like 2 more of this pile. Now I'm just going to glue them on in an alternating pattern on the underside of my bridge archway with hot glue. Once they're all in place, you can trim away any overlaps the same way as before. Very simple, but a little time consuming. I just repeat that step for all of the segments. After those are all finished, using the exact same method, I'll cover up my tower with bricks as well. This has a pretty good look once it's all covered up. Now I need to deal with these gaps in my railings. For this, I'm just going to cut out some squares of foam core and then draw on a bit of a brick pattern around the edge. Once they're textured and ready to go, I'll line up my bridge and put a bit of glue on both segments, but not connecting the 2 segments. Then I put my new square piece in the glue on both sides so that it is technically holding the 2 segments together. This might seem a bit weird, but this was my method of making sure that it lined up properly after they're all put in place. Then I just take my knife and cut down the seam, separating the segments again, and moving on to do the same thing on the other side of the bridge. This does a pretty decent job of hiding my mistake from earlier, and it looks like an intentional detail on the outside of the bridge instead of something that's just hiding my mistake. Now to focus on the tower. I'm just going to mark out where the pillars meet and then cut an angle onto my bottom piece of the pillars. Then I'm going to trace out a floor for the second story of the tower, texture it, and glue it into place. I'm not too concerned with making the inside of the tower look really fancy here. If you want to spend the time to make it look good, do it before you glue it on, because once you glue it into place, it's very hard to reach in there and start putting detail work on it. I wasn't too concerned, and I just wanted it to exist but not be too flashy, so I didn't spend the time on it. But if you do, make sure you do it before you glue it. I add a couple more squares to even out the height of the first story, and then I cut out a larger square that is going to be the roof of my tower. I trace it to shape, texture it, and then cut out the excess. To add some detail to the top of this, I'm going to use my kitchen scissors and trim some popsicle sticks to size, and then I texture them with my X-Acto knife by just pulling it along the grain of the wood to exaggerate the look of the wood grain. And then I glue them to my foam core just with some lines of hot glue. Looking back on the project, I realize I make 2 really annoying mistakes here. The first one's not so bad because it's mostly cosmetic. I just should have trimmed all of those planks to be like 2 or 3 planks long, like shorter planks, and then tiled them together on the rooftop. This would have given me a better texture, it would have been more realistic, and yeah, like it would have made it look better, but it's not the end of the world that I didn't do that. The second mistake is more of a pain in my ass. I didn't think about the fact that I wanted to have a trapdoor on this roof, so now I have glued a bunch of popsicle sticks, and I'm going to have to try and chop a hole in them to make my trapdoor. But at this point in the video, I haven't made that connection yet. So here I go, just drawing out some battlements for the sides of the tower and gluing them in place around the sides. One thing I have done right, and intentionally, is the sides of the battlements that overlap the bridge, I have left a bit of a gap in the foam core that I can cut away. This would be so that the guards could shoot arrows or drop rocks down on the people below without them having to lean over the battlements, exposing themselves. I don't know if this is ever going to come up in my D&D game, but that's something that is historically accurate, so that makes me a little bit happy. Now I'm just going to use what's left of the bricks that I have cut out from earlier and just add some more thickness to my battlements. Next we're on to the trapdoors and ladders. So I'm just going to cut a 1 inch by 1 inch hole in my second floor, which is very easy because it's just foam core. Now I'm starting to come to terms with what I have to do to my roof. I trace out the hole on the bottom side and I cut away the foam core, then I struggle quite a bit to cut through the already in place popsicle sticks with my X-Acto knife. I'm being very cautious not to put the knife through my finger, but I do get by without any accidents. However, I do eventually snap the tip of my X-Acto blade. After breaking myself a small hole through, I take my scissors and use it to pry away the rest. I do not recommend doing it this way, but I kind of boxed myself into a corner with that one. After that is finally behind me, I'm going to get to work on making a little trapdoor. The door itself is going to be 3 popsicle stick segments glued to a piece of wire for the hinge. The frame will just be foam core with the wire poked through it. This is a very similar technique to the doors I make in my modular tower build as well. I glue a bit of barbecue skewer to the bottom of the trapdoor to add a bit more strength to the popsicle sticks. And for some more added detail, I attach pieces of these cocktail skewers as metal bars and a handle. Once my trapdoor is ready, I sandwich it between 2 pieces of foam core for the frame and I glue it together. Then I trim away any excess wire and I draw some wood grain on my foam. Now I can glue it in place over my hole. For the ladder, I have a really simple method here. I'm just going to cut a length of bamboo skewer to size, and then cut up a bunch of planks out of popsicle sticks. I'll texture those planks the same way as before, and then cut them in half lengthwise. Now I'm just going to mark out where they sit on the skewer, and glue them into place with hot glue. I'm going to glue a couple small squares of foam core at the top and bottom of my tower segments. This is to hold the ladder so that it isn't sitting flush on the wall. Then I'm going to take my ladder, which you may have noticed is tall enough to cover both my stories, and glue it in place on the first story segment. Now I can clip my ladder to size on the first segment and glue it perfectly in place on my second segment so that it lines up just right. So now I'm going to take my ruler and mark out an angle onto my XPS pillars. Then I'm going to use my utility knife to cut the slope into them. Once that's good, I'm also going to use my utility knife to bevel the corners and add a bit of damage to the pillars. To strengthen the tabs on the side of my roof, I'm going to glue a couple popsicle sticks in between the battlements and the side tabs of the foam core. This is so that the magnets have something a little more sturdy to stick to than just one single layer of foam core. Now I need to add the final step to this build before we start painting it. I need to make the gate that goes through the first story of the tower. For this, I'm going to mark out how big I want it and then cut it away with my kitchen scissors. Now I'm going to cut out some foam core squares that fit standing up on the top of my bridge. While I think about how I'm going to create my gate shape, I get to work on something I know I want to have, a portcullis, or 2 portcullises. For this, I'm going to piece it together out of various lengths of bamboo skewers. I measure them out and then chop them up with my wire cutters and glue the whole thing together with hot glue. Once that's set, I use my wire clippers again to trim the tips of the skewers so that they don't pierce through my foam. So while working on that, I had an idea about how I want to finish this gate. So to start, I cut some rectangles out of the foam core and then I glue them to the sides of my tower so that they are parallel with my railings on the bridge. I use my triangle ruler to line them up with where the opening of the tower is, and I trim them to size. Then I glue some pieces that are the same size a little higher up on my tower. I repeat those steps on the other side of the tower, and this is because it's going to be a 2-sided gate. Now I'm going to take my rectangles from before and draw on some archways. Then I can cut away the middles of those archways and glue them in place onto the supports onto both sides of my tower. Now my 2 portcullises fit nicely on either side of my tower. However, I want to have a way to display the gates when they're open without removing the portcullises entirely from the piece. So I am going to cut the tips off of 2 more bamboo skewers and then glue them with hot glue at an angle into the bricks of the second segment of my tower. This is going to make a little hook that I can just lift the portcullis up and hang it off of. Really simple but effective. So now our gate is pretty much complete. I'm just going to cut out a couple more rectangles and glue them onto the sides of the supports to add a bit more detail to it so that it's not just like a flat piece of foam core. As one final detail for the bridge, I'm going to take some more skewers and cut them to length to fit along the tops of all of my battlements and railings. This is going to give the whole thing a bit more strength, and when it comes to painting, I can make these look more metallic so that I'm not just painting like a giant gray stone thing. Once that's all set, it looks like this. I think that last step really adds a lot. Now it's time for the magnets. For this, I'm just going to mark out where I want them all to sit with a silver Sharpie. Then I'm going to take my wood burner and burn holes that are just big enough for the magnets to sit comfortably. Then I fill those holes with hot glue and put my magnets inside, making sure that the polarity is correct because you want your bridge to be holding itself together instead of pushing itself away. The places that I've put the magnets are basically where all of the bridge segments connect, and then also in the pillars that go up the sides of the tower. I started with just 2 magnets on the edge of each bridge segment, and that turned out to be not quite strong enough connection for them because they're a little heavier than I thought they'd be. So they kind of didn't hold each other together that well. So I went back the next day and I cut a 3rd hole and added a 3rd magnet on all the horizontal bridge segments. The tower was fine by itself. Gravity is kind of helping hold it together. But for the other ones, I added an extra magnet. So it's 3 instead of 2. Okay, our bridge is completely assembled. Now it is time to seal it. For this, I'm going to use the Black Magic base coat. Link to Jeremy's video about this in the top right. This is basically just black paint mixed with Mod Podge. I keep a pre-mixed batch in an old salsa jar, which I pull a muscle trying to open every time it dries shut. One thing that really helps is to lay down a layer of parchment paper over your workspace if you can. This is awesome because the base coat and paint won't stick to the parchment paper, so you keep your workspace clean, but also your painted pieces won't be sticking to your workspace, which is really helpful. I'm going to use a large cheap brush to completely cover all my pieces separately. Having a cup with water nearby really helps to dip it in and water down your base coat a bit so that you can get into some of those tricky areas. So this step is a little tedious, but make sure to be thorough. You want 100% coverage on all your pieces. It will really help hold everything together, and we will be painting right on top of the black after, so there's no paint base coat required. Leave that overnight, and it's ready to paint the next morning. So for painting this bridge, I'm going to use my new favorite stone painting recipe. It's very similar to what I had done in my runes video and my modular tower video, and it works really well, so I'm going to use it for the bridge as well. To start out, I'm going to take graphite, and then using a makeup brush, I will overbrush that onto all of my stone and my gates. This is like a dry brush, but you still have quite a bit of paint left on the brush, so it's technically not a dry brush. Once I'm finished with that, I'll repeat that step, but with just a regular gray. Keep in mind the areas of your bridge that would be in shadows, like underneath the archways, and leave some of those areas with just the graphite overbrush, and don't cover it up completely with your new gray. Now I'm going to take a dark taupe and overbrush the pillars and the extra squares on the sides of my bridge. This is an attempt to give them a bit of a different look than the rest of the regular stone bricks. I also coat the insides of my tower with the taupe. Next I grab light taupe and use that to highlight all the areas I just hit with dark taupe. I also use a bit of the light taupe just to add some random patch areas, to add a bit of diversity across the rest of the bridge. After that I'm going to move on to my first real highlight with suede. Now I'm going to stop overbrushing at this step, and I'm going to make sure that I'm getting most of the paint off of my makeup brushes and focus on getting a really nice dry brush. I'm going to use this on all of my stone pieces. For my most dramatic highlight, I'm going to be dry brushing with vanilla. For this, make sure to be very gentle with your dry brush and only put it on the brightest areas. It looks a little crazy when you apply it, but we are going to be using a dark wash on the whole piece, and the dark wash is going to bring this brightness back down to a more reasonable level. Now we're finished with the stone, and it's time to move on to the wood. I'm going to overbrush the wood with a chocolate brown to start. Once that's finished, I'll move on to a regular brown and start overbrushing everything we just hit with the chocolate brown. Then as a highlight, I'm going to dry brush with golden brown. For the roof, I'm going to dry brush the wood with suede because it's exposed to the elements and that tends to really gray out wood, keeping it outside, so that works pretty nicely with the suede. The ladder on the inside can stay as it is because it's protected by the walls and it wouldn't have the same graying effect. While I have it out, I'm just going to use that suede to touch up any areas where I got brown onto my stone. The last thing we need to paint now is all the metallic pieces. Due to the lockdown, I ran out of silver paint and I haven't been able to pick any up. So I'm going to make my own gunmetal color using this metallic white and bronze colors that I have, mixed with a little bit of black paint. Now I'll just dry brush that gunmetal onto the gate. And I will just simply use the bronze out of the tube onto all of my skewer railing bits that we added at the end of the build, and the metal parts on the trapdoor. Once those are dry, I'll dry brush the gates with a lighter silver color, and then dry brush all the bronze bits with a gold. Now for the final step, the wash. I'm just going to use the leftover wash from my Tiamat's Tower of Tyranny video, link in the top right. I detail about all the steps for how to make that from scratch, but I'm just using the leftover for this video, so if you want to see how I make the wash, check that one out. I'm just going to take a regular brush and pretty much soak all of my pieces with this wash. I'm keeping an eye out for areas where the wash is awkwardly pooling and making sure to wipe the excess from those spots, but other than that, I am not being conservative with this thing. Leave that for a few hours to dry, and that's it. You're finished. If you want to protect this from your player's greasy hands, you can hit it with a clear coat, but other than that, you're all good. Here's what it looks like all together. So that's my modular bridge video. If you had a good time, I have plenty of other crafting and painting videos that you can check out. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Have a great week. Now it's time for the magnets. For this, I'm just going to mark out where I want them all to sit with a silver Sharpie, and then take my wood burner and bend.
Did you put yourself a tongue twister?
I always do that.